On the night of their 11th wedding anniversary, Marianne stood alone in her dimly lit dining room, a single candle flickering weakly against the weight of silence that filled the air. She had spent hours preparing everything: his favorite roast chicken from the restaurant where he once proposed, an expensive bottle of wine she'd been saving for years, and even the delicate silk scarf she wore, which he had gifted her on one of their early anniversaries. But as the clock ticked past 7:42 p.m., Daniel still hadn't come home. Instead, a text message arrived, running late. Meeting ran over. The words landed like ice water splashed across her chest, cold and impersonal, devoid of any hint of regret or affection. 5 minutes later, another notification buzzed on her phone, a photo sent by someone anonymous. It showed Daniel at a rooftop bar, his arm draped casually around a young woman named Vanessa. They were laughing, their faces glowing under string lights, both wearing matching scarves, the same scarf Marianne had wrapped herself in countless times, believing it symbolized love. In that moment, something inside her cracked open, not with rage, but with clarity. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she poured herself another glass of wine, her hands trembling slightly, and stared into the flame of the candle before her. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war. The morning after the night of the anniversary, Marian woke with an unsettling clarity. It wasn't anger that propelled her, it was something colder, sharper. Suspicion had taken root in her mind like a weed she couldn't ignore. She began to notice things about Daniel that had always been there but now felt glaringly out of place. His shirts, once casually wrinkled from long workdays, were pressed into sharp perfection. The faint scent of cologne wafted off him, a fragrance she didn't recognize and certainly hadn't chosen. And then there was his phone, perpetually silent and face down on every surface he touched. These small changes might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but to Marianne, they were fragments of a puzzle too ominous to ignore. One Tuesday evening, as Daniel walked through the door at 8:15 p.m., shrugging off his coat and offering a perfunctory kiss on her cheek, Marianne realized she no longer trusted the man standing before her. "You've been getting home late a lot," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of water, and replied without looking at her, "We're ramping up for the quarterly audits." "Stressful quarter, you wouldn't really get it." The words landed like shards of ice, cutting deeper than any accusation could. There was no malice in his tone, just a quiet dismissal, as though she were someone who existed only in the background of his life. That weekend, under the guise of spring cleaning, though spring was still weeks away, Marianne decided to tackle the garage. As she sifted through boxes, dusted shelves, and rearranged Daniel's golf gear, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar tucked inside the side pocket of his golf bag. Her breath caught. Slowly, she pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a pair of pearl earrings, elegant, understated, the kind of gift that whispered intimacy rather than obligation. She remembered mentioning them months ago during a rare shopping trip, pointing them out in a jewelry store window. At the time, Daniel had waved her off, saying, "We should be saving, not splurging on things you'll wear twice a year." Yet here they were, nestled in satin, accompanied by a receipt dated 2 weeks prior. They weren't for her, they couldn't be. Marianne's hands trembled slightly as she opened her phone and took a picture of the receipt. Then, with deliberate care, she closed the box and returned it exactly where she'd found it. When Daniel entered the kitchen the next morning, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone, Marianne slid a mug toward him. "I found a gift box in your golf bag," she said lightly, as if commenting on the weather. He didn't flinch, merely smiled with forced ease. "Retirement gift for one of the VPs. She's been with the company for 30 years. Marianne nodded politely, her expression unreadable, but her eyes lingered on him a second too long. She knew he felt it, the weight of her scrutiny. From that moment, Marian became a silent investigator, piecing together truths Daniel thought he'd hidden well. She created a folder on her laptop labeled Truth, though its contents were far from straightforward. Every charge on their joint account, every cryptic text message, every photo sent anonymously, all of it went into this digital archive. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry or scream. Instead, she methodically documented everything, building a case not for court, but for clarity. Each screenshot, each saved voicemail, each transaction record was a brick in the wall she was constructing around herself, fortress of evidence that would shield her when the storm finally broke. Late one night, while Daniel slept soundly beside her, Marian sat at her desk, her laptop glowing softly in the dark. She opened the folder and stared at its contents. What had started as idle curiosity had transformed into something more profound. A realization that Daniel wasn't just betraying her emotionally, he was erasing her entirely. The earrings, the receipts, the careful avoidance of her gaze, they were all pieces of a larger narrative, one in which she played no part. For years, she had allowed herself to fade into the background, believing that sacrifice was synonymous with love. Now she understood the truth. Silence wasn't strength. It was surrender. And so Marianne resolved to stop whispering. She didn't know how the story would end, but she vowed to write her own version, one where she wasn't just a footnote in someone else's tale. The morning after Daniel's callous dismissal at the community center, Marianne sat at her kitchen table, her laptop glowing softly in the dim light. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, the way he had publicly undermined her with such calculated indifference. But now, as she scrolled through their joint account statements, something else caught her attention. A charge from 3 days ago for $3,247.189 stood out like a scar on an otherwise pristine record. The transaction was labeled the Grand Mayfair Hotel, Miami Beach. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. Miami? He hadn't mentioned any trip to Miami. Her heart didn't race. It felt eerily calm, almost mechanical, as though it already knew what her mind was only beginning to piece together. With deliberate precision, she clicked into the transaction breakdown. 2 first-class airline tickets, a bottle of vintage champagne from the hotel's rooftop bar, a spa package upgrade, and then the final detail that made her stomach churn: a romance package reservation under 2 names. Not hers and Daniel's. Someone else's. Marianne leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the screen, but seeing nothing. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft. Their money, her money, funneled into a lie. For years, she had sacrificed her career, her ambitions, even pieces of herself, all while Daniel subtly rewrote their narrative to suit his needs. Now, here it was, laid bare in black and white numbers, 3,247.18. It wasn't just a figure. It was a declaration, a statement that said, "You don't matter." She picked up her phone and dialed the bank's customer service line, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The representative answered cheerfully, unaware of the weight of the conversation about to unfold. "Can you confirm these transactions?" Marianne asked, reading off the details. There was a pause, followed by the chirpy reply, "Of course." 2 first-class tickets, a luxury suite booking, and additional amenities, including a romance package upgrade. Everything appears to be in order. Marianne's grip tightened on the phone. And how many guests were registered? She pressed. Another pause. 2 guests, came the response. When she hung up, the room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls had shifted inward. Each word from the bank echoed in her ears, amplifying the reality she could no longer ignore. Daniel wasn't simply cheating on her emotionally or physically, he was erasing her existence entirely. Every cent they shared was being redirected to fuel a life she wasn't part of. This wasn't love gone wrong. It was systematic dismantling. Financial abuse cloaked in the guise of marriage. That night, Marian opened a new folder on her laptop titled Financial Misuse. Into it, she dragged screenshots of the hotel receipt, the itinerary, and the itemized charges. Each file was meticulously renamed: first-class tickets, champagne purchase, romance package. She worked silently, methodically, as though building not just evidence but armor. Her hands moved without trembling, her thoughts razor-sharp. This wasn't suspicion anymore, it was clarity. Clarity wrapped in rage, so cold it burned. As she saved the last document, her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. His name flashed on the screen like a taunt. She hesitated before answering, letting it ring twice before pressing the green button. "Hey," he said, his tone casual, almost too smooth. "Everything okay back home?" Marianne exhaled slowly, her voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "I noticed some charges from Miami," she said evenly. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then his laugh, a brittle, forced sound. "Seriously, Marianne? You're checking the statements now? God, this is what I mean. You make everything so tense. You just sit around reading books all day and inventing stories in your head." She listened to him rant, let him spill his rehearsed outrage until he paused for breath. Then quietly she replied, "Enjoy the rest of your trip," and hung up. She stared at the phone for a moment, then opened a fresh document. At the top, she typed, "Timeline of Betrayal." Below it, she listed dates, transactions, locations. This wasn't emotion, it was structure. Structure built on truth. By the time she finished, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She walked to the mirror in the hallway, the same one that had reflected her silence for so long. Tonight, however, it showed her something different. Standing there, Marianne saw not the woman who had once whispered apologies or excused absences, but someone else entirely. Someone stronger. Someone ready to fight. "You see now," she whispered to her reflection. Then, turning off the light, she returned to her desk. The folder labeled Truth sat open on her laptop, its contents glowing faintly in the dark. This wasn't just documentation, it was reclamation. Reclamation of her voice, her dignity, her life. The annual community meeting at the local center was supposed to be an ordinary affair, rows of folding chairs, a PowerPoint presentation on neighborhood initiatives, and polite applause when names were called. But as Marianne walked into the room that evening, her pulse quickened. She had seen them before they noticed her Daniel, in his usual navy blazer, standing beside Vanessa as if nothing were amiss. Vanessa wore a sundress too bright for the occasion, her smile polished but brittle. To anyone else, they might have looked like colleagues or casual acquaintances. But Marianne knew better. Every glance between them, every subtle touch of Vanessa's hand against Daniel's arm, screamed defiance, a silent dare directed at her. Marianne didn't flinch. Instead, she took her seat near the front, smoothing the creases of her charcoal gray blouse with deliberate care. Her presence wasn't accidental. She had dressed for this moment, not to impress, but to command attention. As the program began, Daniel stood up to introduce Vanessa. "This is Vanessa," he announced cheerfully, his voice carrying across the room. "She's been helping me with outreach efforts in Charlotte." The words hung heavy in the air, dripping with insincerity. A few heads turned toward Marianne, their expressions unreadable. They knew. Everyone knew. When Melissa, the program coordinator, hesitated mid-handshake with Vanessa, glancing nervously at Marianne, it was all the confirmation she needed. Rising slowly from her chair, Marianne stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Melissa's. "I'm Marianne Foster," she said, her tone steady, each syllable landing like a stone. "Daniel's wife." Legally, there was no malice in her voice, only clarity. Gasps rippled through the room, soft but audible. Daniel cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Jesus, Marianne, this isn't the time or place, he muttered under his breath. Yes, Daniel, she replied, her gaze unwavering. You made it the time and place. Returning to her seat, Marianne felt the weight of what she had done settle over her. Not fear, not regret, but resolve. For years, she had allowed herself to shrink into the background, letting Daniel rewrite their story. Now, she had reclaimed the narrative, even if just for a moment. That night, unable to sleep, she opened her laptop and began typing. At first, the words came haltingly, raw and unfiltered. She wrote about the silence, the suffocating kind that masquerades as peace. She wrote about losing her voice, bit by bit, until she barely recognized herself. And then she wrote about the turning point, the photo, the earrings, the trip to Miami. Each detail became a thread pulling her closer to liberation. By dawn, the draft was complete. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, a testament to survival, resilience, and the courage to break free. Submitting the essay to Modern Grace magazine felt like stepping off a cliff, but rejection didn't sting as much as she expected. Their feedback was clear. Too personal for our current editorial direction. Too personal? She smiled bitterly. Of course it was personal. Pain always is. Meanwhile, Daniel escalated his tactics. One afternoon, while scrolling through notifications on her phone, Marianne noticed something alarming. Their joint bank account had been deactivated. A text followed moments later. I've moved the funds to a separate account. Fewer distractions will help you focus on your writing. His condescension burned, but she refused to let it unravel her. What Daniel failed to realize was that 2 weeks prior, Marianne had withdrawn $20,000 from a forgotten royalty account tied to her old columns. She transferred the money into a private account under her maiden name, ensuring independence long before he could attempt financial sabotage. With those funds, she hired Clara Lawyer, recommended by Eleanor, her former editor. Together, they drafted a strategy documenting every instance of misappropriation, manipulation, and betrayal. Marianne didn't want revenge. She wanted justice. When she submitted a formal complaint to Daniel's company board, attaching irrefutable evidence of his misuse of corporate funds, she included a note, signed, a woman who knows her worth. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, a fragment of the life she had sacrificed for a marriage built on lies. And though the battle ahead loomed large, Marianne faced it with newfound strength. She wasn't fighting for closure anymore. She was fighting for sovereignty. For the first time in years, she understood what it meant to truly stand alone and survive. The email arrived at 7:42 p.m., the same time Marianne had waited for Daniel on their anniversary. It was addressed to 3 members of the company's board women she had meticulously researched, chosen not because they were sympathetic, but because they valued transparency and accountability. The subject line read, Internal Financial Misconduct, Confidential. Inside, Marianne attached a PDF file, its pages brimming with evidence, expense reports, invoices marked confidential, receipts from luxury spas and yacht charters, all funneled through Daniel's corporate account under Vanessa's name. Each document told a story of betrayal, not just personal but professional. At the bottom of her message, she signed off simply, a woman who knows her worth. 2 days later, the fallout began. An emergency email circulated among senior management, effective immediately. Daniel Foster is suspended pending internal investigation. His access badge has been deactivated. The man who once strode confidently into meetings now found himself locked out of his own office. By noon, whispers rippled through the halls. He wasn't just being investigated. He was crumbling. HR convened closed-door sessions, finance launched an audit, and Daniel's pristine image as a reliable regional director shattered like glass beneath a heel. But Marianne didn't gloat. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about exposure. She watched silently as Daniel unraveled, his panic seeping through texts and voicemails laced with desperation. "Let's talk," he wrote. "We can fix this." When they finally met at a quiet cafe far removed from their shared history, Daniel looked nothing like the polished executive she once knew. His shirt collar was wrinkled, his tie askew, his hands trembling slightly around a coffee cup. He tried reasoning, bargaining, even pleading. "We had good years, right? Maybe we can try again." Marianne stirred her tea slowly, her gaze steady. "You tried to erase me," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "And now you want to rewrite us?" She leaned back in her chair, letting the silence stretch between them. For the first time, Daniel flinched, not because of anger, but because of truth. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just clarity spoken plainly. When he left, defeated and hollow, Marianne felt something shift, not triumph, but release. In court, the battle intensified. Claire presented a digital audio file recorded months earlier at a company party. Daniel's voice came through clearly, cocky and unaware. "Look, Vanessa, I'm not divorcing Marianne until that policy hits the mark. She's got a clean record, low risk. It would be dumb to walk away from $500,000 in coverage." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Next came the financial documents' itemized lists detailing how corporate funds, meant for strategic planning retreats, had instead funded spa treatments and designer handbags for Vanessa. Every transaction was dated, organized, undeniable. Daniel's legal team requested a recess, but never returned with a counter-argument. Instead, they scrambled to contain the damage as the media picked up the story. Headlines blared across state forums. Corporate scandal unveiled. Senior executive faces felony charges. Marianne refused interviews, letting the evidence speak for itself. But when offered a chance to testify publicly, she declined. "I'm not here to destroy him," she told Claire. "That part will take care of itself." And it did. The court ruling stripped Daniel of everything: the house, his reputation, and the illusion of control he'd clung to for so long. What remained was a man diminished, standing alone in a rental apartment, reading over the formal notice from the state attorney's office. Following an anonymous tip, an investigation had been launched into corporate expense misuse, employee favoritism, and potential fraud. Now facing felony charges for misappropriation of funds and ethical violations, Daniel found himself trapped in a narrative he could no longer manipulate. Meanwhile, Marianne moved forward. Her memoir deal was announced, her first draft title "Burning the Blueprint." Reclaiming Myself After Silence garnering early buzz in publishing circles. At a local business luncheon, she was introduced to Lyle Hawthorne, a private equity consultant specializing in restructuring companies facing ethical crises. He smiled after her panel speech and said, "I think you're exactly the kind of voice a place like Foster and Beck needs. I can get you a minority stake if you're interested." Marianne blinked. Foster and Beck, the very company where Daniel had once wielded power. Irony warmed her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. 3 months later, she walked into her first shareholder meeting, not as a guest or someone's wife, but as an investor, an owner. She didn't come wielding axes or flames. She came with notes, questions, and a commanding presence that made people sit up straighter. When it was her turn to address the room, she stood slowly, hands folded in front of her, and spoke with the ease of someone who had earned every syllable. "Abuse doesn't just happen in marriages," she said. "It happens in boardrooms and hiring decisions, and how we bury problems instead of solving them. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to help rebuild the kind of structure where people aren't afraid to speak. The room fell quiet, not with discomfort, but understanding. Daniel, now working as an independent consultant from a rental apartment, never showed up to the meeting. He didn't need to. His chapter was closed. The first time Marianne saw her name on a book cover, she didn't cry. She had spent years silencing herself, burying her voice beneath layers of compromise and fear, but now, here it was, burning the blueprint, reclaiming myself after silence. The title glowed like embers in the dark, a quiet rebellion against everything that had tried to extinguish her. Inside those pages lived not just her story, but a roadmap for others who had been told their worth was tied to endurance, silence, or sacrifice. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a declaration. Her publisher called it timely. Readers called it life-changing. Critics described it as a reckoning wrapped in prose. But for Marianne, it was simpler than that. It was survival. When she stood at her first book signing, pen poised over the glossy cover, she felt something unfamiliar yet profound: validation. Women lined up to speak with her, some clutching dog-eared copies of her book, others holding journals filled with notes they hesitated to share. One woman whispered, tears streaming down her face, "You put my pain into words I couldn't find." Another said, "I thought I was alone until I read your chapter about the roses." Marianne nodded, not because she understood every detail of their stories, but because she knew the weight of what they carried, the invisible chains forged by silence. As her book climbed bestseller lists, invitations poured in. Panels, conferences, podcasts, all eager to hear from the woman who had dared to dismantle her life only to rebuild it stronger. At one event, held in a packed auditorium beneath soft amber lights, Marianne stepped onto the stage wearing the same charcoal gray blouse she'd worn during her speech months earlier. This time, however, the room wasn't silent. It erupted in applause before she even spoke. She smiled faintly, letting the noise wash over her. These were no longer strangers. They were allies, witnesses to the fire she had lit within herself. "I used to think that speaking out meant shouting," she began, her voice steady but resonant. "But sometimes breaking silence is quieter than that. Sometimes it's choosing to walk away when everyone expects you to stay. Sometimes it's refusing to let someone else write your story for you." As she spoke, slides appeared on a screen behind her, excerpts from her journal, photos of the financial records she'd meticulously documented, and finally, an image of the note Vanessa had left taped to the fridge. "Good luck, Daniel. You're going to need it." The audience laughed, but there was no malice in it, only recognition. They weren't laughing at Daniel. They were celebrating Marianne's triumph. By the end of her tour, Marianne had become more than an author. She was a movement. Her advocacy inspired legislators to draft Marianne's Law, a bill aimed at increasing transparency in marital finances and protecting victims of financial abuse. Advocacy groups rallied around her message, hosting workshops across the country titled "Reclaiming Financial Confidence." And then came the emails, hundreds of them, from women, thanking her for giving them permission to leave toxic relationships, to demand accountability, to reclaim their voices. One evening, after a particularly emotional talk, a young woman approached Marianne backstage. Clutching a notebook, she asked hesitantly, "Do you ever feel guilty for taking back your power?" Marianne paused, considering the question carefully. Then she replied, "Guilt is a luxury I can't afford anymore. What I feel instead is freedom, and if that makes people uncomfortable, so be it." 3 months after the shareholder meeting, Marianne stood in the boardroom of Foster and Beck, not as a guest or Daniel's former wife, but as an owner. The irony wasn't lost on her. It was almost poetic. She had been dismissed by Daniel as someone incapable of understanding the complexities of his work. Yet here she was, leading discussions about restructuring ethical practices within the company. Her position as a minority stakeholder came with quiet power. Every decision she made rippled through departments, forcing accountability where none existed before. At first, some executives bristled at her presence. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning how someone who had once been labeled a distraction could now sit at their table. But Marianne didn't need to shout to command respect. In meetings, she spoke softly but firmly, each word carrying the weight of experience and undeniable truth. When asked why she chose to invest in this company specifically, she replied without hesitation, "Because I know what happens when silence becomes complicity, and I won't let that happen again." Her influence extended beyond corporate walls. Back home, Marianne transformed the garage into a modest event space where women gathered for workshops, titled Reclaiming Confidence After Control. These sessions weren't just lectures, they were conversations, lifelines for those still trapped in marriages or systems that sought to diminish them. One Saturday afternoon, a young woman approached her after the session, clutching a notebook filled with frantic scribbles. "How do you start over?" she asked, voice trembling. Marianne placed a hand on hers and said simply, "You don't wait for permission." It wasn't all smooth sailing. Some attendees accused her of being too harsh, others thought her methods impractical. But Marianne knew better than to seek universal approval. She remembered the days when staying silent felt like survival, how wrong she had been. Now, she encouraged these women not to endure but to act, even if it meant dismantling everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and self-worth. Amidst this whirlwind of change, Mark entered her life quietly, steadily. He was the doctor who had treated her during her hospital stay months earlier, the one who saw her pain without trying to fix it, who listened more than he spoke. Their connection grew slowly, rooted in mutual respect rather than grand gestures. On a crisp autumn morning, while sipping coffee together on her porch, he asked, "What are you saving that bottle of wine for?" Marianne smiled faintly, running her fingers along the label. "For my 10th wedding anniversary," she admitted. His eyebrow quirked. "And now?" She laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "Now I'm glad I waited for something better." They married 6 months later, not with fanfare, but with intention. No diamond ring, no extravagant vows, just two people promising to stand beside each other without erasure or compromise. For Marianne, it was enough. It was everything. The night air was heavy with the scent of lavender, a fragrance that once symbolized calm but now carried the weight of years unspoken. Marianne sat on the porch swing, her hands loosely wrapped around a glass of wine. The house behind her hummed softly, a space she had reclaimed not by tearing it down, but by rebuilding herself within its walls. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about her journey had been. But perfection wasn't the goal anymore. Peace was. And peace, she had learned, wasn't handed to you, it was earned. She thought back to the early days after discovering Daniel's betrayal. Back then, silence felt like a prison, suffocating and inescapable. She had spent years believing that enduring meant loving, that staying quiet equaled strength. But what she hadn't realized until much later was that silence could be two things at once, a cage or a weapon. For so long, she had let Daniel shape their narrative, rewrite her identity, and bury her voice under layers of compromise. When she finally chose to break that silence, not with rage, but with clarity, she turned it into something sharp, deliberate, and unstoppable. It began small, saving receipts, documenting transactions, capturing screenshots. Each action felt insignificant on its own, like tossing pebbles into an ocean. But over time, those pebbles formed ripples that grew into waves. By the time she stood before the board of directors, Presenting evidence of Daniel's misconduct, she understood the power of persistence. Breaking silence wasn't just about speaking up. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed abuse to thrive unchecked. Her story became more than personal, it became universal, a mirror reflecting countless women trapped in similar cycles of control disguised as care. Marianne leaned back slightly, letting the swing sway gently. The stars above blinked steadily, indifferent yet constant, reminding her how endings often bled into beginnings. She remembered the first time she held a copy of her memoir, burning the blueprint in her hands. The title alone carried defiance, a declaration that she no longer needed to fit into molds created by others. Writing it hadn't been easy. Some nights the words came haltingly, raw and jagged. Other times they poured out like rain after a drought. Through every page, she confronted not only Daniel's lies, but also her own fears. Fear of judgment, failure, rejection. Yet with each sentence, she shed another layer of doubt, reclaiming pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. Her workshops became sanctuaries for women who arrived broken but left emboldened. They shared stories of husbands who controlled finances, partners who dismissed dreams, and families who demanded sacrifice without reciprocity. You don't have to burn everything, she would tell them. Sometimes all you need to do is burn the version of yourself that believed you weren't enough. These sessions weren't lectures, they were lifelines, reminders that happiness didn't require perfection. Happiness required courage, the courage to end what was wrong and start again, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Mark appeared at the doorway, holding a dish towel slung casually over his shoulder. His presence grounded her, a testament to the fact that love shouldn't demand erasure, it should celebrate authenticity. Together, they had built something new, something real. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. Just quiet moments filled with trust, respect, and mutual understanding. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling a warmth that wasn't just physical. It was the kind of comfort that came from knowing she was seen, not as someone's wife, survivor, or asset, but as herself. As they walked back toward the garden, where fairy lights twinkled softly among laughter and conversation, Marian paused briefly. She glanced at the horizon, where the last remnants of daylight lingered stubbornly against the encroaching darkness. Life, she realized, mirrored this balance, light and shadow coexisting, neither overpowering the other entirely. Ending her marriage hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Beginning anew hadn't been flawless, but it had been hers. Some fires destroy, she murmured aloud, almost to herself. But some fires clear away the overgrowth so that something new can take root. Mark nodded silently, understanding the depth of her words. Later that evening, as the guests departed and the candles burned low, Marianne sat alone on the porch swing once more. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying whispers of change. She looked up at the stars and whispered, "Not everyone gets a perfect marriage, but we all deserve the chance to end what's wrong and begin again our way." Beneath her ribs, where once sat an ache, now burned something steady aflame, alive and unwavering. And she knew deep down that it would never go out.